Welcome back to Navigating Carbon, your compass to carbon management. As always, I'm your host, Deb Ryan, and in this episode, we welcomed Jenny Morgan back to the podcast. Jenny has just published her first book. It's called Cancel Culture and Climate. And Jenny joined me to discuss all things cancel culture. She's passionate about this topic and finding ways that people across all sectors of the industry, both within sustainability and across different industries, can try and break down barriers and find ways to communicate and collaborate so that we can all work towards the ultimate goal, emissions reduction. Jenny's book is now available on Amazon or through her website, and I've put links below in the show notes. As always, if you like our episode, please make sure you subscribe so that you can get all upcoming episodes. But for now, sit back and enjoy my conversation with Jenny. Welcome to Navigating Carbon, everyone, and welcome back to Jenny Morgan. Thank you for joining us again. It's so good to have you back. So thank you.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
We are here today because you have just published a book called Cancel Culture and Climate. Congratulations. I've read it, clearly, because I've tabbed it. Tell us all about it. Tell us what you're writing about and what you've been working on.
Of course. Yeah, I have experienced this and have seen cancel culture happening in the impact space for many years now. I just hadn't named it yet, but I was first introduced to it when I was seeing organizations pick and choose what exactly they were going to put out into the public in fear of retaliation or public scrutiny. And so I found that to be curious, where at times organizations and individuals will be very loud and proud and bold in sharing some of their the positivity that they've injected into the world, and then be a bit more silent or vague about other instances that could either be somewhat problematic or could also be positive, but then it's dealing in a realm that often becomes polarized. And so I started to kind of see this more and more, and as I become more and more inundated in the climate space, I see it everywhere. I see it within the climate movement. You got nature-based solutionists and tech solutionists arguing, activists and sustainability corporate professionals arguing, those that promote regulatory advancements versus more industry-based improvements. And so there's all this arguing, and I'm in this camp, you're in that camp. And so I've been speaking about it. It's really resonated with people that have heard me talk about it and some of the workshops that I've facilitated. And so I felt like it was time to put it on paper.
Awesome. Well, congratulations. And we'll include in the show notes, if people are interested, where they can get their own copy of it and some of that kind of stuff, because it is really great. So I wanted to dive in on some of these things, right? You've just covered a lot of different pieces, and it's a really interesting, I know you and I've talked about some of this stuff before, but like when you start to become aware of it, I think it becomes a lot more front and center. And so one of the things you talk about early on, and you sort of even just alluded to it, is this idea of like extreme categorization, and both on the people side and also on the company side. So like when you say extreme categorization, like can you explain what that means and how you sort of frame it?
Yeah, so there's a cognitive pattern that humans are very susceptible to, and it's dichotomous thinking. And it's this or that, good or bad, all or nothing type of thinking. And I, for one, am definitely one that struggles with that. And
Yeah.
I think it's very natural. We like to be quick in our decision making, and labeling, it gives the false impression that we can get to the final destination faster if we can quickly label things. But it actually removes any opportunity for nuance and actually just the reality of the world. We're not all good and we're not all bad. And we're all somewhat of a gray mixture of all of these things. And that's what makes us human. That's what makes us companies. That's what makes us interested in evolving and learning. And so it's actually a really beautiful aspect of being human, is that we are not one thing. And my main thesis starting the book and kind of kicking that off for the reader to start thinking about that is that we have to be comfortable with being both, that it's not going to be a choice, it's actually all of it. And then as long as we show up better the the next day, that's progress, and that's something that should be celebrated. And so it's kind of flipping the whole model on its head of actually we should be much more comfortable in being uncomfortable.
It's, I mean, it's fascinating, right? Because it's something I have encountered a lot throughout my career. Again, some people are familiar. I'm a petroleum engineer. I come from that oil and gas background. And when I first moved more into the emissions and decarbonization space, I had people say to me, like, it's so disappointing you're leaving industry. I was like, wait, what? Like, it's this, like, you're either in, like you said, you've got one foot, you're either in or you're out, or you've got one foot in one camp or you don't, or like, if you work in a certain industry, you're bad versus if you work in another industry, you're good. Like, we do it really naturally. And, unfortunately, I think in our very short attention span culture, and again, I'm very guilty of this as well. Like, I'll just read headlines, right? You don't necessarily go in and read the article or whatever and stuff. And headlines are polarizing, right? So it's just this understanding and thinking about and stepping back. You talked about nuance and stuff. Like, it is really important, right? Like, how do you see that turning up? And, talk about some of the examples you've seen around this idea of like getting down into the nuance and like trying to have those conversations so that we're not just screaming at each other from separate sides of some made up like boundary. Like,
Right. The worst of it is when we're screaming at each other on separate sides of a boundary and it's actually the same team. That's the worst instance of it. But yeah, the lack of nuance in that way of thinking is one of the most problematic aspects of it, because you mentioned headlines. You may be formulating an entire opinion, either positive or negative, but negative is easier to point at and it's a little bit more salacious. But if you hear a negative headline and you've formulated an opinion based on said headline, you're ignoring any of the actual details of why this headline has infuriated you, why this headline is bad, who's bad, what is the intention here, can it be fixed? All of these forms of curiosity are removed when we don't respect nuance in these types of ways of thinking or these types of scenarios. And in the book, I mention a lot of examples. In the first draft of the book, it was like double the size of just all the examples in climate and outside of climate where lack of nuance and understanding can just be so problematic. But I see it with the carbon market, for example. You can get to using carbon credits is bad and decarbonization strategy exclusively is good. You can get into that type of way of thinking, but what if it's actually both? And I reference a few studies where it actually shows that if you do pursue both, if you look to decarbonize your business and invest in carbon credits, you actually have a more holistic strategy that produces results faster and more effectively. And so I use these examples to kind of show that when we don't think of the nuance and the details and we're just simply categorizing in these broad buckets, we're actually losing all opportunity to work together, to learn, to evolve, to represent a more full version of what climate strategy looks like.
yeah, well, and I've seen it again, like you talked about, and I think it's not intuitive for folks, even people within the space, and you use the idea of like nature-based versus tech-based removals on the carbon credit side. I've seen it even in terms of like some of the like nuance within some of the different types of carbon credits. So like taking cook stoves, for example, I was talking to someone recently about, well, if cook stoves weren't going from burning dung and wood all the way to electric, if they were doing that in between step of actually using like LPG, using like natural gas, then it was a failure. Instead of this whole idea of like, well, no, it's still a step. Like, and like, how do we bite pieces off? How do we solve, the whole piece? And I think, again, one of the things you talk about is figuring out how we find a common narrative. And can you talk a little bit about how important that piece is so that we can start to like bridge some of these gaps a little bit?
Yeah, in the book I talk about, I mean, we're using these somewhat nuanced examples. In the book I talk about the electrification of vehicles, and I was privy to one of these debates where there were two people kind of talking about, are EVs a true benefit to the climate movement? And they were talking about how, there's going to be such a reduction in emissions based on transportation. And then the opposing side was talking about how harmful the mining practices can be, and that there's a lot of negative social implications that come with this advancement. And so it's kind of like you have to choose. Are you going to drive your gas powered Ford Explorer forever because EVs have challenges that still need to be overcome? Or are we inspired by this innovative technology that can actually have really good benefits? And if we're more transparent in its flaws, we can work together to actually overcome them. So it's this kind of back and forth. And then someone just popped up in the middle of it and criticized cars in general and promoted public transportation. And they actually, I would feel like, won the debate just because they were kind of the loudest and they had the most stats and heard the latest NPR, episode, and, had a lot of really good data points that they could reference on why cars are harmful to the planet and to people. And it didn't, all it was just a ego-based movie that we all were privy to watch, and no one left feeling good about it. I left and drove my EV home and felt like I had completely missed the mark, deeming myself as this, very climate forward individual. But then now, am I good? Am I bad? And I think we missed the common ground. We didn't really find the fact that everyone in the room was looking for ways to improve a very harmful and scary and urgent time that we are all experiencing at one moment, and that it's going to take all of these solutions. You should be taking public transportation. You should be moving towards electrification. We should be inspiring people to not buy new vehicles if they don't need to replace their old one. Like, it's kind of all of it. And these are all nuances that if we don't actually establish common ground where I want to live in a safe and secure place that my loved ones can thrive in, then if we can't come to that understanding and that recognition between one another, then we'll never be able to evolve as a group, which will ultimately fail.
And in that example, and I want to kind of pivot to how like companies kind of start framing some of this, but the big piece around this, particularly in the US, is this idea of consumerism and how we buy things and, stuff that goes on it. And I think even your example there of like, someone might have like an internal combustion engine vehicle, but if they keep it for 20 years, like, that's going to that will have a positive benefit, because, this whole idea of us needing to buy new things every 2 years, whether that's an iPhone or the latest thing, right? And it can be a real challenge, that this consumer kind of like treadmill is the word I'm looking for, that we are sort of on, and that I think we're all a little bit guilty of. But like the role of companies, and you've got an example in the book around plastics and recycling, and I think it's really important because I think, again, as an individual trying to make an impact and trying to, think about that, like, to be honest, I grow a lot of my own food here in Denver and it's snowing, and I had dinner last night that came out of my garden that we'd preserved. Great. Do I expect everyone to do it? No. Is it something I enjoy? Yes. So there's other benefits to these things, but like companies have a role to a certain extent around messaging and how we think about the things that we buy from companies and some of this kind of stuff. Like, how do you, talk us through that, right? Like in terms of the company's pace of like the plastic, like I said, the plastic recycling example of like, how do we think about branding? How do we think about nuance around that? And like, I don't know, like.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that the Please Recycle campaign, I put that in the book because that is the most well-recognized form of a cancel culture campaign that I can use that it simply impacts every single person, because it's begging the end user, the consumer, to just please recycle. If only you would do this. It's shaming that individual it's accusing them that they are making a choice to not do something. And so it's very shame based. And by using shame, we are still in a place where the recycling industry is incredibly inefficient. And so it hasn't promoted that sense of curiosity. And so I used it as an example of showing how shame-based campaigns and cancel culture is ultimately ineffective. It might be loud, but it doesn't actually create behavioral change. And then I use other examples of how there's, some shame-based campaigns against carbon credits, for example, and how they're a license to pollute. That's often an accusation that it's a way to cover up harmful acts. And so you just kind of pay it off through a carbon credit. But in actuality, there's studies that show that that's not the case. And so that shame campaign against those that have purchased carbon credits have made people operate in a way that they feel scared to talk about it. Companies are fearful of disclosing if they have purchased carbon credits, or they are reliant on carbon credits to achieve their climate goals, which you will have to do that if you want to achieve net zero. And so it's creating these symptoms. So like if cancel culture is the disease, then these are the symptoms that we're all dealing with, like greenwashing, green hushing, green recanting. These are these symptoms that organizations are now displaying due to this disease of this culture that we've created, of this kind of pursuit for perfection rather than celebrating progress.
So let's stay with that bit on the company side. So you just threw out three terms and I think people, a lot of people probably heard of greenwashing. But I want you to can you explain what do you mean by greenwashing, green hushing, and green recanting? Because I think it is, like you said, it is really kind of like important in terms of how we have some of these conversations.
Yeah. So greenwashing is the accusation that you've lied or exaggerated your claims. And it's an accusation. So there are instances where people, those that are making a decision on behalf of a brand, have decided to straight lie about their environmental impact. And I use Volkswagen as an example because years ago they falsified information and actually put mechanisms in their vehicles to falsify information so that they could claim an environmental benefit. That is lying. That is the textbook version of greenwashing. However, there are some that you've got a lipstick container that only has 2 inches of real estate to talk about 3 years of climate work that they've done in one small 2-inch banner here. And so they're going to make it concise, a 6-word claim that talks about how they're a green lipstick. They too are accused of greenwashing because there's some misunderstandings about various chemicals or materials they might be using. And so again, it's this lack of nuance. Everyone is a liar. Everyone is greenwashing, when in actuality, it's not. It's very nuanced. There are some times that people are making decisions that are very harmful. And sometimes there's a marketing and communication gap that needs to be altered and fixed. So that's an example of greenwashing. Green hushing is when an organization is operating in silence. So this too has nuance. There's some organizations that are green hushing, meaning that they are kind of hiding any flaws that could be detected. And so they're kind of keeping themselves silent. They're only really showing some parts of their work and keeping other things a bit smaller. Or really the most problematic side of green hushing, and I think green hushing is the scariest symptom of them all, is when an organization is doing something positive and they're not telling anyone about it for fear of public scrutiny. And I think that is the most damaging action and symptom that is occurring in this type of culture that we've created, because we don't know what we don't know. And there's so much progress and positive impact that's occurring that we just simply don't know about because it's not going to be in the Guardian tomorrow. It's just not talked about.
Yeah.
So that's green hushing. And the last is green recanting. Green recanting has been referred to as, the climate exodus, or the American Forest Foundation referred to it as green freezing. But it's basically renouncing your climate claims. So you're kind of walking it back. We're seeing a lot of that happening with DEI right now, and as well as climate. There's a lot of groups that had 150 members and now it has 6. And so we're seeing a lot of that kind of walk back, because we're not proving that there is ROI in impact for businesses. And that is the wrong move. We need to be encouraging more action rather than creating more fear in action.
I think let's stick with the green hushing piece right now, right? And I think correct me if I'm wrong, but that has come about because of greenwashing, right? Because companies tried to go out and say, look, we're doing this good thing. They got so much pushback from a whole range of different stakeholders. So now they're like, well, we still want to do it, but we just don't want to be exposed, right? Is that kind of yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you've seen brands attempt to share something and then have been accused of greenwashing. Therefore, their competitor is not going to talk about something equally positive, because look at what happened to their fellow shoe manufacturer or whatever. And so they're just going to keep it quiet.
Yeah. So you talked about transparency in this, how do we, my dog has an opinion about this clearly. But you talked about transparency, and we're going to talk about accountability here in a second as well. But how do we try, and it's very difficult for companies to be transparent on anything, but particularly on climate and things like that as well. Have you seen, I know you talk about some of these in the book, but it's sort of part of the problem, right? How do we be transparent and almost be authentic, which people seem to want from their brands and stuff like that, without the negative impact on share price or value or whatever it is, right? It's challenging.
Yeah, I definitely respect it. I mean, being vulnerable as a brand that's reliant on stakeholder perception is a lot to shoulder in a time where every single movement and choice is going to be heavily scrutinized. I think that with transparency, the brands that are doing a fantastic job at it are the ones that not only share positive outcomes of the year in their sustainability report or whatever they're doing, whatever that cadence might be, they're sharing the positive impact while also right behind it sharing the obstacles that they experienced, as well as the obstacles that they're continuing to try to overcome. So it's really embodying this sense of progress and not perfection. You look at Patagonia, for example. Patagonia, I think we could all somewhat agree that Patagonia could just stop here. They've kind of done what they needed to do, and they've reached a state that some would deem as perfection. However, Patagonia is doing it right, because every year they talk about what they're going to do next, what is the flaw, what is the challenge, what they're doing, what they could be doing better, and really using that self-reflection as a brand to continue to push themselves further and further. And that sense of positivity has had an impact on the fashion industry. There's many apparel companies that would be deemed their competitor that are actually following suit and standing alongside them. And so transparency needs to be honest, that it's not dichotomous, that it's not, this is all the shiny, perfect stuff we did this year. No, 2024 was great, but we also ran into a lot of obstacles, and this is what our focuses are for 2025 and 2026, and this is the plan, and being really just at the forefront talking about the good and the bad.
I love that. And so thinking about, going beyond transparency, and you talked a little bit earlier about accountability. So I know you've talked a lot in the book about how do we avoid canceling but keeping people accountable. So discuss kind of what that means to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing to talk about is when I speak to people and brands that are very passionate about a movement, and we can keep it in climate just to stay on track. But when I speak about these concepts, a lot of times they're there's a feeling of being, somewhat enraged by the fact that, well, they're going to get away with it. Like this kind of, by eliminating cancel culture, we've then given everyone a free pass to do whatever they want. And that is in no way what I'm saying. Accountability is still something that we need to be promoting and placing upon brands and individuals to be accountable for their actions and to improve. But there's a huge distinction between the two. One is shame based and one is motivating. And so you can still put boundaries and standards around behaviors and metrics and, however you want to measure positive impact. But what it needs to do is it needs to be promoting a positive outcome, not something that excludes or eliminates entirely. Cancel culture wants to feed and eliminate, whereas accountability wants to promote, push, and progress. And so there's a difference between the intention behind the two. One is rage-based and one is actually looking for something positive to come out of the situation.
And going back to your Patagonia example, like it's almost like, trying to be that sort of positive conversation of like, yeah, how do we progress? Like knowing that things aren't perfect. And, it's sort of built, for them, it's also worked from a bottom line point of view because it builds brand loyalty as well and stuff like that. So it's almost like, yeah, thinking about that sort of very authentic kind of conversation, it does, the fact that you just mentioned that other people are following suit, like you can see that it is also beneficial for companies, even from a strategy point of view, as well. It's kind of interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, we see it in our friendships and we see it in the brands that we resonate with. It's the ones that feel like a representation of us, of our reality, and it's not an either or. And so it's really, I love the B Corp movement, how there's a constant push to progress, but within a time frame that makes sense. It's a 3-year reassessment, like that kind of cycle where it's not pressured. It's actually inspiring. And so I want to encourage brands to be the ones to step out and be authentic in what's going on behind closed doors so that everyone can celebrate, support, innovate together, and then you'll also see industry somewhat follow suit. Everyone will kind of have a breath of relief.
Well, and the time piece that you just sort of talked about there is also really important, right? Like we are facing a really large problem, right? Emissions in the atmosphere, from lots of different greenhouse gas sources. And it's ultimately, how do we take each step versus like I don't think there's any silver bullets that we've found, and that might change with technology and things like that. But like celebrating those steps, because lots and lots of steps get you somewhere eventually. Like it's kind of an interesting, it's always, it's always challenging to break down big projects, right? But how do you do it? One step at a time. So it's not going to be no different. So you've said it a couple of times, and in closing, I kind of want to see, get your final thoughts on this. And I appreciate you coming on to talk about this. It's been, again, a conversation that I feel like continues to come up of like, how do we have end conversations? But you wrote, and I quote, "Perfection isn't the goal, progress is." And you've said it a few times already. I think it sums it up really well. So like what, if anyone has one thing that they take away from today and they buy the book and they read it and as we want them all to, what's the one thing that, you want people to think about as they're going about their own life, their own job, all of the things?
Yeah, I would want people to, I mean, you think about the climate activists and you think about the sustainability professional and the climate curious person that maybe picks up the book as just kind of a New Year's resolution or something. I want to create a place where you feel confident in what you're doing, and perfection will never bring confidence. They do the study of Olympians where, who's the happiest afterwards. And it's always the third place medalist because they've medaled, they're on the podium, but they didn't like barely make it like the second place person that's kind of like was right there and I did whatever that caused me to not get first. And then first place that's just so overwhelmed with being deemed the best on the planet that there's really nowhere to go from there. And then they're going to maintain that level of success for 4 years until the next Olympics. Like, what do I do with this? And so I feel like if we could apply that to organizations in their pursuit for climate impact, we can celebrate third place and be really proud that we are invited to the Olympics and we're medaling, and we also still have more to learn and more to go. If we can create a culture that is cheering people on and cheering leaders on to say, I'm so glad that you did this and I can't wait to see what you do next, and create that kind of culture, it will ripple out. There's a ripple effect in that type of leadership. And so I would implore sustainability leaders and decision makers that have a real impact on this type of movement and how fast and effective we are right now to be confident and to be proud of the choices that they're making that actually make a difference. And I think that that's something we should celebrate.
I love that. Jenny, thank you so much again for everybody. Cancel Culture and Climate. Get your copy of it. It's great. So thanks for joining me.
Thanks.